Hey everybody, my name is Mark Heaps. Welcome to another Adobe Max session, this time 2021. For those of you that are new to my session, welcome. Thank you for joining. I really appreciate you giving me some of your time. For those of you that are returning, welcome back. I missed you guys, and I hope we get to do this again at some point in person in the future. But I'm glad to know that everyone out there is safe and sound. This session is called Techniques to Boost Your Workflow in Adobe Photoshop. And for anyone that's ever seen any talk I've given or content that I've produced, you know that I'm very, very passionate about a subject called production advocacy, where I really care about designers working in a way that doesn't just get the job done, but gets it done in a way that makes them happy instead of them working hard. So in this session, we're going to talk about a way of mixing some of those new techniques and features in Adobe Photoshop with some of the classic older techniques in Photoshop. But the main goal being, how do we accomplish replicable tasks so that we can execute the density of our projects in a faster way that doesn't involve us just stepping and repeating manually? So with that being said, let's look at a project that I think is pretty typical for most people. We're going to look at how to take a design treatment, start it off, and then actually turn this into an automated process. All right, let's dive on in. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and this is a fairly typical treatment of any company, whether it's a financial report, an annual report, presentations they're working on. We've got a few basic elements here in our production treatment. So what we can see is we've got a subject that is isolated and brought to the front of their background. The background itself is knocked out to black and white. We've got a graphical treatment here that is part of the brand. So we see these sort of techno wavy lines going on. They have a particular color set on them. And then this is basically a done graphic. We would save this as a JPEG. We might then take these out and put it in one of those projects like the report I was mentioning earlier. So the thing is this is not hard, right? Most people with some basic skills in Photoshop can do this. They can figure out how to mask the person out. They can do the black and white treatment on the background. But what's important to recognize when you're working this way on a project is that you can already map the steps out in your head that you use to get this done. Anytime you have a project where you can actually map out the steps in your head, knowing exactly what production techniques you're going to use, should be something that you can replicate within Photoshop. So the goal here isn't to make a perfect finished piece on a mass batch of images, but how do I get 70 or even 80% of the work done through automation so that I can actually come back and just focus on tweaking and adjusting things rather than me manually replicating these steps on every single image in my final piece. So let's take a look at that. So we're going to do this from scratch so everybody can figure this out and follow along. Again, remember that you can watch this video at any time after Adobe Max in case you get confused. So let's start from scratch. I'm going to get rid of all these layers that we had here. So this was our starting image, right? So right out of the gate, what we're going to do is record an action. Now, actions are old. They've been around in Photoshop forever. But when I travel around and I visit various design teams or internal design groups, which unfortunately haven't done a lot of during COVID times, but when I was visiting, I didn't see a lot of designers using actions other than for obvious things like resize the image or convert it to black and white. It was sort of a one and done single step approach when they'd use their actions. For those of you that are doing this, bravo. I really applaud you for taking those steps. But we're going to cover some other things later in this lab to hopefully show you some new tricks too. So let's go in here and go to Window, Actions. Now I have some actions that I've already made, and I'm regularly making actions for my project. So let's make one today. First thing I'm going to do is create a new set, and we'll call this Adobe Max 2021. So now I've got a new set for this particular workflow. And then I'm going to go in here and create a new action. Now, when you create a new action, it's immediately going to start recording. And if you've never used actions before, what this does is it records the steps in a very linear fashion of how you work. Now, we're going to talk more and more about this through this lab because there are right ways and wrong ways to get some efficiency out of this. So let's go ahead and create the new action. We'll give it a name and we'll say report photo treatment with graphic. Okay, and we're going to hit record. Now you could add a function key if you wanted a quick key, but I don't need that today. We're just going to record that into this directory and start the process. So here you can see a little record button is running, right? So what do we need to do first? If we think about the steps in this process, well, I know that I'm going to need this person to be isolated. So right out of the gate, I'm going to take this background layer and I'm going to make a copy of it. We'll drag that down to the new layer button. And now you see it says background copy. Now, interestingly, in your actions, it records not only the action that you did, but certain metadata and descriptors, right? So it actually now knows that there is a background copy layer and it remembers these names, like you dragged a copy of background. Now, we need to mask this guy out. And historically, this has been a real pain when you're doing an action because every contour was different on every single photograph. But whenever you get into a menu control like select subject, that means it can run its process once you've prompted it to. So I'm going to choose select subject. And there you can see Adobe Sensei did a great job selecting this person and giving me these marching ants here that goes around the outside of their shape or their silhouette. So now I can press the layer mask button and it adds a layer mask to background copy. And again, you can see up here all these steps being recorded. See it says make there, that means make layer mask. So we're doing pretty good so far. Now what about that graphical treatment that we had in the background? Okay, that's clearly something that is not a photo. Well, what I've got here is a placement. So I'm gonna go File, Place, Embedded. And on my desktop or in a directory somewhere, you've got a vector file. So here's a horizontal lines vector file from Adobe Illustrator. And this is a simple line path going to another line path with a blend option set on it, and then saved out as an AI file. If you want to learn more about some of these techniques in Illustrator, check out my Illustrator session this year at Max. Now I'm going to place this, and it's going to give me a little prompt. Do you want to open this as a smart object? And I do. I want to be able to retain that editability linking back to Adobe Illustrator. Because remember, the goal here is doing the density of the project, not just trying to finish it right out of the gate. So if I want to be able to go back and tweak any of these settings, a smart object is a great way to go. I'm going to press OK here, and it'll give me that little placement. Now I'm going to resize it, just drag this up so it goes off the canvas, and hit Enter. Now, there's what I personally consider a bug inside of Adobe Photoshop right now. You can see that this says it's a smart object, but it actually doesn't retain all of the editing capabilities on this smart object that traditional smart objects have. The one I'm talking about is warping, transform warp. That's how we get that cool fluid line look that you saw earlier. So what I'm going to do here is hit Free Transform, Command T. That gives me my bounding box. But do you notice that warp isn't available? So escape to cancel. What I need to go do is actually go to this layer and right click on it and choose Convert to Smart Object. Even though it's already a smart object, it needs to be told again to make it a smart object. So now when I hit Free Transform, the warp feature is available. And this will now allow me to go in here and start pulling these lines and getting some interesting kind of wacky appearance values here. So we'll just mess around with this. Let's go this way with it. I'm going to go over to the other side. I'm just going to hide my actions panel. Let's bring this one down. And so for this lab, I've provided everyone access to that vector horizontal file so you can play around with it. This is a really, really fun thing to do, just taking some basic geometry, some basic lines, and really play and just see kind of what stylization you can get. So I'm just going to pull this a little bit further. Kind of looks like a candy wrapper. But let's say that that is basically done. Okay, so I'll pull that up. I'm going to hit Enter, and that applies the transformation. Now, this is set, but I need to move it down. Remember, actions are still recording. So I can pull this down so that it's between those two layers. So it knows to move the current layer, which was the one that we free transformed. So now I've got this down below. Now I want it to have that blue color that we saw earlier. So what I'm going to do here is, instead of trying to go back and recolor the vector object, I'm going to actually use layer styles here in Photoshop to do the colorization. This way, I can always change that style in the action at a later date, and it's not always dependent on what the object is from Illustrator. So I'm going to go down to this little effects button here and come up to color overlay. Now, you can see I've chosen blue, and I've chosen the blend mode overlay. So why isn't it showing up? Well, when you take blue and overlay it on something that's black, you're still just going to see black. So the trick to this is that I need to go back to that layer and turn the fill down to 0%. And now we get to see those flying blue lines in the background. If we don't like that blend mode, we can always go back in and change the overlay blend mode setting. But here's why it's important to know your steps beforehand. It's already recorded me setting the layer style here. So if I go back in and change it while we're recording, it's adding that extra step to the process of the action. And this makes batch processing really, really slow. You want the most minimal amount of steps as possible so that it doesn't overload your system. So last but not least here, we've got that set. I'm going to go choose the background layer, and it says select layer background. And then I'm going to choose black and white. Now we've got a black and white background, our graphic element flowing through the middle, and then our knockout of the person fully in color in front. And if I wanted to do any kind of image adjustment to that image in the background, maybe I go in here and I choose levels, using an adjustment layer from the half-dipped cookie down here. And I'm just going to reduce the contrast on it by changing the output sliders. Okay, and I'm going to change that brightness to make it a little bit darker by sliding to the right. And that ensures we're going to get to see more of those blue lines. Okay, there we have the action recorded. Now I've got to press stop recording to make sure that it doesn't get anything else. So let's press stop. Now we want to test this and make sure that it's working properly. So what we're going to do now is open up a different image. We'll go in here, see if we can find another one. Yeah, this one's pretty cool. Got another one here. This is a really hard one. So this guy's got all kinds of things in the way. There's different depth to the photo. I think this is going to be a pretty good test. So I'm going to choose this one. Again, these images are all from Adobe stock. And so I'm going to press open, and here's my image. Now all I have to do is go back up to my action that I recorded earlier, called Report Photo Treatment, and press play. Now, one of the things to remember if you use this particular technique in your workflow is that vector file that we place, it always has to be the same name in the same location. So if you have a big project, this is probably fine. You just keep it with the project folder. But just know that if you ever move that around, the action isn't going to work. So let me hit play. It runs through. It's going to go through all those steps. Right? So right now it's processing in the background. It's doing that sensei technique. It's doing the darkening, and there it's already done. So now you can see I've got my levels in here, my black and white adjustment. He got masked out. The blue graphic lines are in here, and it's basically done exactly what I asked it to do. So this is what I'm talking about. The dense bulk of the project or the production piece is now done. Now I can go in here that the action has stopped playing, and I can go in here and actually make some adjustments. So maybe I don't need the levels on this image. See when I remove that, how nice the graphic looks itself? So I could go in here, trash this, and then I'm basically done with this file. I could hit save, make that ready for my project. So now you see how quickly this can help in your workflow. Let's try one more just so you can see it again. So here we have another guy. This one's got some reflections and things. Let's give this one a try. We'll hit play again. And there you go. Graphical element added to the background. There's the black and white backdrop. The person's cut out and put in front. And this has saved me a ton of time. And I still have all of my layers here editable if I need to. So even if I wanted to go back to Illustrator, I could go in here and double click on this smart object and get access to the vector file if I wanted to change the line weight or if I wanted to change any details about those vectors. So this is a great way to speed up your workflow. Okay, so let's show how we would apply this to a batch of images. Now you can go to File and come down and choose Automate Batch, but actually the technique that I prefer is using Script's image processor. And what this does is it allows us to change a couple of other settings around file formats and directories. So here I've chosen the folder that has the source images. That's my industrial worker shots. Press OK there. And then what do I want to do with this? Well, I want to save it out into a different folder. So we're going to choose exports there. And that's a folder that I made within the project folder. Now down below, this is where it gets interesting. Under file type, you could have it export as a JPEG, a PSD, or a TIFF. And you could do all of this at the same time. You could check all of these boxes. You could also say, I'd like you to resize to a particular dimension set for your project. So if these are really high res, you may want to scale them down to a smaller size, or you could have them stay the same size for a PSD, but give you a smaller version as a JPEG where you resize it down to maybe 1,000 by 1,000 pixels. And it would automatically, regardless of width or height orientation, fit within that parameter because we gave it the same longest edge. It's a square ratio here. Now, I don't need the JPEG for this demo because we might want to go back and tweak some of these layers when we're done. Again, trying to get 80% of the project done. So down here at the bottom where it says preferences, and this is the key area, we're going to choose to run action. And then in here is my pull down menu of all the action sets that I've made. So I've got Adobe Max 2021. And then here's that report photo treatment with graphic that we named earlier. And so with this, I'm going to press run. Hopefully this doesn't take too long. These are actually pretty high res images, but let's see how we do. It seems like that's taking about maybe 8-9 seconds an image. That's pretty good, especially considering how high res these are. And that means that it is definitely working a lot faster than I would be able to work and replicate all of these steps. Even with some shortcuts, this gets a lot faster for me. So I could also be doing something else at this time while it's working its way through. Okay, we're getting down to our last few here. And then we'll check this out inside of Photoshop to see how those layers came out. Now this one has 2 people in it. That'll be interesting. All right, and there we have it. It finished up. So now, if I actually go look in that directory, we can see here's the PSD files that got added to exports. So this means in here, I have each of those files and the graphic has been added. Let's go through and check some of these out. So some of these backgrounds are a little dark and I probably wouldn't want them to stay this dark. So this is where I really like having those PSD exports because I have the layer still from our actions. Now this one even has an error on it because you can see the orange in his hand. So this is something we'll have to go back and fix the mask. But the rest of them seem like they've done a relatively good job. I'm actually very, very happy with this set. So let's look at this one first because his arm got messed up. So we'll just open that up. Now we can go in here and start looking at that mask and kind of what happened with it. So I'm going to hold Option and click on that layer itself. It's got some other things added over here as well. So let's go up to that layer mask. We'll quickly just lasso around that. I'm going to fill that selection with black so it hides that area in the mask. And then what I need to do is figure out what's going on with the rest of his arm here. So we'll choose to select subject again. Looks like it's trying to find things based on that similar hue, but I'm going to use the object selection tool. I'm going to go in here and say Shift, or hold Shift. I'm going to go around this arm and see if I can get them to add this to the selection. Don't fail me now, Adobe Sensei. There you go. So it's added that arm. I don't want this little piece back here. Get rid of that. I don't want this little piece of the helmet up here. It's actually something in the background behind the helmet. Just add a little bit more of that helmet there. And then we definitely don't want this big piece over here, but for that I'm going to use a regular marquee and I'll hold Option to remove it. All right, so now if I go back into this layer mask, in fact, I can just trash that mask, delete it, I don't want to apply it, and then I'll choose a new layer mask for it. And then when we turn all these layers back on, now we're actually getting the proper technique. Now, again, I don't know if I actually like having the lines go behind the arm, but that's irrelevant to this lab. We're not talking about design aesthetics at this point, we're talking about workflow. So what you've seen is all of these files have had the majority of the work already done to them, and now we're just tweaking and adjusting, right? Again, I could go in here and turn those levels off if I think it's a little bit too dark, but at least I've set myself up to work this way. All right. That was a really, really advanced way of boosting your workflow let's look at something that's maybe a little less advanced, but still extremely beneficial. Okay, so let's work on our next lab assignment, and that's going to be a type of transformation. Now, you've probably had a situation like this before where you've got an image that you're going to be compositing into some sort of backdrop. And we're not going to talk too aggressively about compositing today. That's its own specialized thing. But there's some basics and fundamentals that have changed in Photoshop to make our life easier when we do this. So you can see here we've got this yellow box. And if I try to put it on this surface, it doesn't quite map the perspective anywhere, and it's way too big. So what are we going to do first? Well, I'm going to convert this yellow box layer to a smart object. So we'll right click on it and we'll choose Convert to Smart Object. I almost always do that, and I know it makes our file sizes larger, but RAM is cheap, memory is cheap, storage is cheap compared to the amount of hours I might waste if I ever have to recreate something. So for me, I'm almost always using a smart object where possible. This means now that if I go to free transform this, I can size this down and try to get this to map. Now you can see even as I'm getting smaller here, the perspective just doesn't really fit. It kind of is almost right there. I could try to fake it and maybe rotate it a bit. But if you've ever had to do this, you know, trying to grab a corner and free distort it, you get some really weird effects, and it doesn't actually understand true 3D. So what we're going to do is a different technique. Let's make it a little bit smaller first so that it actually fits into the shot that we're trying to composite into. And let's say that we want it to fit roughly somewhere around here. Now, what we want to do is use a different type of transformation. So we're going to go up to Edit, and we're going to come down to where it says Perspective Warp. And Perspective Warp is really neat because I often get product shots from clients or my stakeholders, and it just doesn't quite match from one product to the next. They're very close, but they're not quite there. So instead of me spending all the time nudging those, we're going to let Photoshop do a big chunk of the work for us. So what this does is it allows you to draw these sort of quants or quadrants. And the way we do that is we're just going to click in here and it produces our first grid. And what you want to do is map this to the dimension of the product. So I'm going to take this outer surface. Now this isn't really 3D, but it's really good at faking 3D. So I'm going to take this one now, drag it over. And you might notice when I get really close here, these two edges magnetize to one another. When I let go, it snaps to it. So the quad here is just something I got to clean up. And then we'll do one more here. Kind of get this going. There, it's magnetized. I'll let go. It snapped it. And we just drag that down to that magnetizes. And then we make this last piece fit here. So now you see I've got something that looks like a 3D grid on top of our box. Now there's an interesting mode for this feature up at the top. When you're changing it from layout to warp, this allows you to now move into this actual perspective warping mode, this transformation, but it actually understands 3D and perspective really, really well. So basically, if we start taking these corners and saying, I would like to map this more to the other side, you can see it actually moves the box in an interesting way and sort of understands 3D and perspective. So I'm going to take this down. I'm trying to match where the edge of the table is back here. Let's maybe bring this up a little bit. I'm just nudging these corners here while we're in this mode. There we go. So now I've got this in a way that I'm really happy with the perspective and how it matches on the surface. So this is part A of a non-3D approach to working with 3D. So let me just hit enter now and we'll apply that warp. So here we are back in Photoshop. And the great thing is because we used a smart object, it's actually applied this as a smart filter. So if I ever wanted to undo it, I can just click the little eyeball and see how far off it originally was. And here it looks like it matches much better. Let's just move this onto the table a little bit more. Great. Now, what if you wanted to apply some sort of text or some sort of treatment to this box? Well, we have another feature that fakes its way through 3D without actually having to use any 3D engines in Photoshop. So let's take a look at that. So historically, if you wanted to apply a design to something like this box, we would have brought in a piece of art and we would have cut it into various surfaces and we would have distorted it to make it match the contour and perspective of the object you're compositing into. But that always created problems with really detailed patterns because the lines would never quite line up correctly. There was a lot of really funkiness that happened there. So let's look at the way we would do that today to try to save us some hassle. So first and foremost, I want to use a new filter. It's not completely new. It's been around for a little while now, but I still don't see a lot of people using it. So I'm going to create a new layer here, and I'm going to go up to filter, and I'm going to come down to where it says Vanishing Point. It's another way of talking about perspective. Now you'll see here when I bring this up, this is what the finished result will look like. This is one that we produced earlier. This is our grid. So how do we do it? Okay, let's delete that one. And when you start, you'll notice that you get this actual perspective create plane tool. It gives you a little crosshair target in here. And what you want to start with is actually clicking and tracing the contour of the box. And we're only going to do the top surface to try to teach it where we believe the perspective is, where is the vanishing point. Now, here's the tricky part that's not as obvious. What you want to do is hold your Command key on a Mac or Control key on Windows, and from these middle controllers, you want to click and drag. So if I click and drag on that, you'll see it generates a new edge. Now, it's not exactly right on its perspective. It's pretty close. So what we do then is we grab these corners, snap those to where we want them to be, and just adjust from here. Now, it's okay if it actually goes beyond the box, as long as you're matching the perspective. And then we're going to go up here to this top surface, hold that Command key again, click and drag down, and now we're producing our 3D plane. So now we've got our grid made. Now the good thing about Photoshop here is if you pressed OK now, even though we haven't applied any art to it, it's going to actually remember this vanishing point grid with your file. So once I press OK, even though there's no smart object or anything, it actually remembers this information. So I want to put some art on this box. So here I've provided another image. This is kind of a really beautiful watercolor illustration with some ink art in the background here. Just really kind of a neat piece. I'm going to select all and I'm going to copy it. Now that copy moves those pixels onto the clipboard for your system. And this is imperative when you're getting into Vanishing Point because it calls and relies on that clipboard having an image on it. So now if I was to go back up to Filter and Vanishing Point, now I want to be clear for 1 second. Let's make sure that we're doing this on an empty new layer because I don't want to apply this to the yellow box layer, which was a smart object. I want this to be its own layer so we can clean it up and mask it if we need to afterwards. So we'll go up here, choose Filter, and go to Vanishing Point again. And there's our grid. Now I'm going to hit paste because remember we have that art on the clipboard. When you hit paste here, it will always paste it up into this top corner area. And if you need to, you can free transform this. You can hit Command T to resize it. You can rotate it if you need to. Let me just show you that real quick. If I hit Command T, you see I get our traditional bars here. So I'm just going to pull that down a little bit. Now what's interesting is as I start to move this in place, it will snap to the grid of the box as soon as my cursor gets in there. And now we're wrapping the box with that design. And you can see there's the edge of the art. So I want to make sure I don't go that far. But once I like where this is lined up, I'm pretty good to go. And so this is really, really helpful because historically we would have had a problem trying to get this rows to line up here, having these lines carry through. So this has done the majority of the work for us because we've already used that vanishing point grid. So now I can simply press OK. That gets mapped to that dimensional form. And then if I just go over to my layer here, we're going to change it from a blend mode that by default is normal, and we'll use something like multiply or color burn. I'm going to use multiply. And now you can see because we used multiply, all of the white pixels on the layer, they disappear because blend modes are basically algorithms that have a linear command in them. If this, do that. So multiply says, if this pixel is white or a very, very light shade of gray or luminosity, then hide it. And if there's a very dark shade of luminosity or a very dark pixel value, keep it. And so that's why we've got all of these wonderful black outlines in here and the shades from the watercolor retained within this art that we placed on it while all of the white background is gone. So Now that we've done this, we have the ability to go in and make some cleanups, right? We can see down in the bottom here, there's just a couple of edges that are overlapping. And now you would just go in and add a layer mask, grab a paintbrush, make sure it's a nice hard round brush in this particular case. Go back up to the top here. I would use black as my foreground color. And then I would just start going in here and cleaning up these edges and removing all of that overlap that we don't want as a part of the file. Now, some of you are probably smarter than me, and you're realizing the technique that I should be doing right now, rather than this manual approach, which is what many of you would do, is to say, wait a minute, I've already masked out this box. It's already perfectly cut out. So instead of that layer mask, let's trash it. All I have to do is hold the Command key or Control on Windows, click on this layer thumbnail of the yellow box. It gives me a selection of exactly that shape. And then while I'm on the art layer, I can just press the layer mask button, and that cleans up all of those edges for me. So that's what we're talking about today. How do we remember to boost our workflow with some of these little tricks, right? Try not to replicate work that you've already done. This box has already been masked out. It's very easy to select. Just Command click on it and you get those marching ants. All right, let's take a look at something else. Okay, so let's look at another project technique where you can boost your workflow. And this one is a little less common to people. I've been showing it for a few years now in various areas, but I feel like I have to keep showing it because it is so effective. So what if you had a bunch of images like we did earlier, and you needed to give them some form of global treatment? What would be the approach you would take for that? Maybe it's kind of what we did earlier. You know, you can open the image and you can adjust it tonally, make it black and white, maybe warm it or cool it down or something to that effect. And then you would batch it with actions. Well, what if there was a faster way and a more efficient way? Let's take a look at using Bridge with Adobe Camera Raw. So we're going to go to File and we're going to choose Browse in Bridge. And this is a program that comes with Creative Cloud. It's basically the cousin to Photoshop. And in here, you can see I'm already navigated to my folder that has our worker shots in it that we were using earlier. Now, if I was to just go down through here, and let's see, let's actually go back to our tile view. And here you can see all of our images, right? Now, what's interesting is there's a couple of ways that you can use Bridge to get into the Camera Raw editor. And if you had this in Photoshop and it was open, well, you would want to go up to Filter, and you could come down to where it says Camera Raw Filter. And this brings up the editor. If you haven't played with it before, it's amazing. It looks a lot like Lightroom. It's been around much longer than Lightroom, actually. But if you were to go in here, you could say, oh, okay, I can see what's going on here. I can change the white balance on my shot. I could maybe change some of the elements of the exposure of the shot. I could dehaze this one. This one's actually quite hazy. So we could dehaze this and bring back some of that background depth and contrast, bring in some clarity, right? You could be messing around here and hit OK, and this would permanently apply to that JPEG here on the layer. So that's a permanent change. Now you could make that a smart object. I've mentioned that throughout this lab today, and that would allow it to be applied as a filter. But here's the problem with efficiency and boosting your workflow. That's one time edit per image, and we want to be able to work on a global maxima, not a local maxima. So what do we mean here? Okay, let me undo that and I'm going to close it. So if we go back to Bridge, now in here we've got a whole bunch of images. And what we're going to do is take this image, and instead of opening it in Photoshop first and then using Camera Raw as a filter, we're going to go up to the top here, and there's a little button that says Open in Camera Raw. And this is slightly different. It's actually going to open it in Camera Raw without going through Photoshop and doing that as a filter. So the engine like you have in Lightroom is actually built right here in Bridge, which means we could do some really interesting things. Let's go in here actually and maybe do something a bit more artistic. So let's see, if I go to some color profiles here, and if you didn't see that, just here at the top in Camera Raw, there's a little square area button next to Profile that says Browse Profiles. You can go down here and choose Artistic, and there's some color grading that's being done. You could do something that's more of a vintage treatment. We've got some color profiles in here. Okay, so let's choose something like Yeah, vintage '07. Okay. Now, from here, when you choose object, it would open this up in Photoshop as a smart object. Now, if yours doesn't say open object, that's because in mine, under the preferences here for Camera Raw, which you get access to via this link, I actually have it set to open in Photoshop as a smart object. And this is not on by default. So you would need to check that if you wanted to edit it as a smart object in Photoshop. But here's the tricky part. I've made the edit and I actually don't want to open this in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is press done. And what you'll see in Bridge is the preview of the thumbnail, and you see the larger preview here, it shows that edit being made. So I didn't open it in Photoshop, and yet we made some adjustments and the edit is showing up here. And you see there's a little thumbnail icon right here that shows some control sliders. That indicates that this image has been modified by Camera Raw. So here's all these other images that I want to use in my project. Well, how do I get all of these to have that same setting? Well, you can actually right-click on here and go to Develop Settings and choose Copy Settings. And now, if we scroll through and shift-click all these other images, you can see there's all the little previews. Just right-click on any of the ones selected and come down to Develop Settings and choose Paste Settings. And watch all these change. Okay, it's going to ask me everything that I want to include here. These are the settings that were copied from Camera Raw. I'm going to say OK. And now these have all been tinted with that vintage profile. So you can see they're much more green, slightly different than they were before. Now let's take a look at this one as an example. You can see they've all got the icon on here at the top showing it's been edited. So I could right click on it again. Even though we've applied an edit, it's actually not a permanent edit. What it's doing is it's using some instruction on how the pixels should be modified in the way that they're viewed, but they actually haven't modified the pixels permanently. So you can actually go back into Develop Settings and say Default Settings or Clear Settings. And now that image goes back to normal without any edits on it. So you could make adjustments in Camera Raw, come in here and use a script to export all of these into a new format or into just a duplicate of the file. But when you're done editing, it's as simple as selecting all of these images, right-clicking on here, going to Develop Settings again, and saying Clear Settings. These all get reset back to what they once were. That's really, really cool because if you wanted to, you could do massive amounts of edits to a ton of files and never ever need to open it in Photoshop. So let's take a different look at that. So I'm going to make another edit again. So now this time, instead of copying and pasting the settings, what I'm going to do is select all of them first and say Open in Camera Raw. And what this will do is it opens them in kind of a film strip tray inside of the Camera Raw editor up here. So now if I was to select and sync all of these, right? So if I go down here and we select this, I could go in here and say, well, what profile do I want to use this time? Well, let's use black and white. And you see all those thumbnails are turned to black and white. Now, if I go back, I could start playing with some other controllers. Maybe I want to play with color grading. So I could go in here and say, oh, I want my highlights to be a little warm. I want my shadows to be a little cold. And now we're getting into a really interesting treatment on this photo. Okay, I've got that set. They've all been edited. And I just press done, and you can see all of the thumbnails are modified. So it's the same thing that we just did, but instead of doing a copy and paste on the settings inside of the tray in Bridge, we opened all of them in Camera Raw and made all of the edit at one time. And you can see how fast that edit was using Camera Raw, because again, it's not applying permanent changes to the pixels. It's just giving an instruction on how this should look stylistically. So now if I wanted to get a copy of all these in this format for my project, I could simply go to File. Go to Tools. Go to Tools, come down to Photoshop, and then we go to our handy dandy image processor again, the one that I used earlier. We can then use process the files from Bridge. There's 10 of them. Where do I want to put these files? So we'll say we'll put them in exports just like we did earlier. So here they are in exports. Now there's already my PSDs in here. So we'll use the exports folder. And this time, instead of PSD, I'm going to save them as a JPEG, and I'm going to tell them to be much smaller. Let's make them 500 pixels on either edge. And I do not want to run that action again that we ran earlier. And we just hit run. Okay, so now it's going through, exporting all of these from Bridge to that JPEG, but it's also doing the resize at the same time. So there it is, it's done. Now if we go back to Bridge, I've got all my pictures here. I can right click on these and go Develop Settings, Clear Settings. And they're no longer manipulated. They're no longer edited. But if I scroll over, actually go up in this directory, here's my exports folder. There's the JPEG folder of our exports. And you can see these have all been color treated. And you notice how small the image is? Well, if we open one of these in Photoshop and go to image size, you'll see that the longest edge, which is the horizontal edge, is 500 pixels wide. So it made the edit and the resize and the file save all in one round to save us a bunch of time, right? There's no way we could do that by simply going File, Open, then creating an adjustment layer, giving a colorized treatment, doing a file save as, and anyway try to be as fast as this. So this is why I like that technique for basic tonal edits rather than doing it through image adjustments like hue and saturation or levels, and then using an action to batch process it, which has to follow those linear steps of every edit for every image. In this case, we did all of those edits across all the images. So this is a great technique for boosting your workflow. All right, let's look at something else. Okay, for this next one, we're going to look at a fairly typical cosmetic beauty sort of treatment we see in a lot of magazines these days. But I wanted to look at some of the techniques and how we would do the effect. So here we've got our model in the shot and they're on a white backdrop, right? Typical sort of studio catalog shoot. So the first thing we're going to want to do here is mask this person out. And thank goodness these days we can just use Select Subject again. Makes life so much easier. And what I want to do is add a layer mask to this individual. So we just push on that layer mask button down here in the bottom of the layers panel, and that adds the mask for us. Now we're going to create a new layer, press that new layer button. And I'm just going to take this layer and move it to the bottom. So you can drag it down or Command Shift left bracket on your keyboard next to the letter P. That lets you move that down. But if you're more comfortable using your mouse to drag it down, go right ahead. And then I'm going to fill this with a nice bright orange color. So I have one up here kind of highlighted. We're going to use that. If you're wondering what color that is, it is RGB values would be 217, 125, 5. And so I'm just going to fill this background in. Now you could do edit fill if you want to do that the traditional way and go up to foreground color now that we've selected it. And that'll fill that in for you. Or you could have pressed Option Delete on a Mac, Alt Delete on Windows, and that would fill with the foreground color. So we've got our subject masked out. Now the part that I want to show is we've got the direction from our art director to put in a kind of floral, tropical, contemporary design pattern in the background. So how are we going to go about that? Well, we have another file which is called leaves. And what we're going to do is take one of these particular leaves and make them into a pattern for the background. So how are we going to do that? Well, I want to use this leaf right here, number 3. And I could use a number of different selection techniques for this, but I'm really falling in love with the object selection tool. It's basically Adobe Sensei Select Subject, but in a tool. And the default for this is normally a rectangular marquee. I actually prefer it by using lasso. That way I can kind of influence exactly how many pixels and what types of pixels it has to process with. So even though I'm overlapping this other leaves just a little bit, if I let go here, it'll snap and give me a selection of that leaf. Now, because we're going to make this a pattern tile, I need to get this leaf on its own layer. So the quick key for that for me, just simply Command J or Control J on Windows. That will make a duplicate to a new layer while leaving the original layer intact. So now if I turn off the eyeball of the background layer, you can see I have that leaf isolated. Now, how do you make this into a pattern tile? Well, you have to use the rectangular marquee because a tile is a square or rectangular shape usually, at least in Photoshop. And I'm going to drag a selection here that gives me roughly that tile around the leaf. And now I can go to Edit and come down to where it says Define Pattern. Now I'm going to name this Leaf, I think 3, because I've done this a few times now. I'm going to press OK here. Deselect, and now that has been added to Photoshop's pattern library. So now when I go back to our fashion shot, what I can do here is start filling this background in with a pattern. Now, how would you do this? One of the ways that's been promoted for a very, very long time, and with good reason, because it's a great non-destructive workflow, is to go down into our half-dipped cookie here, go all the way up for our adjustment layers, and there's one called pattern. And so this is great. You can go in here, use the pull-down menu, find the pattern that you want to make. You can see I've got a lot of those leaves in here. And when you choose that, I've got a few different leaves. When you choose that, you can go in here and pick the scale. Do you want the tile to be rotated in any way? What is it that you want to do, right? Do we want to increase the size on this? We could make it bigger. That's going to be a really big leaf. Or we could make it much, much smaller. But here's the thing. That is still a basic squared tile that is just being rotated. In fact, it's rotating the entire orientation of the art fill in the background there. So what if I don't want this? I mean, and this is handy, right? Because it's an adjustment layer. If I want to change my mind later, I can come back, double click on it, go in here to pattern fill. I could change that size to something else like 65%, change that rotation, hit OK, and it's completely non-destructive. So this is a viable and great way to work. But I want to show a different way if you want to create more interesting types of patterns. So let's turn that layer off. We'll make another new layer. And this time I'm going to go to Edit, Fill, more classic approach. And under Contents, we're going to choose Pattern. Now, this is going to permanently fill, I guess not permanent, that's the wrong word. It's going to apply the actual pixels to the layer. In other words, it's putting down the photo of the leaf. And you can see I've got the leaf here. But what this does is it allows us to turn on a feature called Script. And in here, we've got a lot of options that you can use to vary and create a more organic looking pattern experience. So right out of the gate, a brick fill, that's what we would have seen in the other pattern. But when you start getting into random fill, let's take a look at that real quick. You press OK. It brings up a controller asking you how do you want to randomize it? What's the density? How small do you want one leaf to be? What's the largest factor of another leaf? Do you want to have it rotate randomly throughout the pattern here? That's a checkbox. Do you want to create some color randomness so that all the leaves don't look exactly the same? Same thing here with brightness. Press OK. And now we've got this random leaf pattern fill going on in the background. And this looks great, right? This looks just like something I would see in a magazine. Now, that is supposed to be chaotic and random and very organic. What if you wanted to get into a bit more geometry? Well, let's undo that one. We could go back into that edit fill, look at pattern again. And instead of random fill, let's check out spiral. And now you can see it's taking that tile and actually turning it by a calculated amount. If I chose keep pattern upright, it would still do the spiral, but every leaf would face upward. So that doesn't actually orient with the spiral. So I don't want to do that. I actually like the idea of it rotating. I'm going to decrease my spacing here. We'll do some color randomness again. And brightness randomness. Press OK. And so there we've got that nice spiral fill. Now, again, if that doesn't look right, you're going to have to undo. It's not as intelligent as using an adjustment layer. You do kind of have to go through this process again and again and again. But we can make adjustments in here. So if I scale this down to a smaller leaf, tighter spacing, press OK. There you can see I get more of that spiral. It's oriented here on the artboard, and this looks great behind the subject. So the one last part I'll show on this, I'm going to undo it one last time, is if you wanted to use a work path with it. So if you wanted to orient the leaves along a path, first we need to grab the pen tool, and we could go in here and draw some kind of vector path. Now you can see at the top here in my options, I have it set to path. By default, your Photoshop might say shape layer. And so you would need to change this to a work path to make sure that you have this working correctly. And so, all right, here we go. I'm going to have this cross up. So I drew a basic path here. Now, the interesting thing about vector paths is it actually knows what orientation. Where did it start and where did it end? Every single one of these anchor points that we made is sequential. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6. So it knows the work path and it knows the order that you drew the path, which means now if I get off of the pen tool, I'll just go to the regular arrow tool here, path selection tool. We'll go to edit fill. We're going to choose that pattern controller again, but this time instead of spiral, we're going to say place along path. Press OK. And now you actually get to see what that preview would look like as it's following along a path. So we'll maybe do a really small scale leaf. We'll decrease our spacing here. Do we want to adjust it to fit along the path? Yes, we want it to stretch out the full length of the path that we drew. What do we want the angle from the path to be? How do we want it to turn from the path? Lots of cool controls in here. How far do you want it to be from the path? Maybe I want it right on there, so it actually looks a little like a vine. And then do we want to alternate our patterns rather than having them all on one side? So I'm going to choose to alternate, and then we're going to have a scale progression. And what this means is it's going to go from big to small. Okay, so we'll just decrease that down here. And then press OK. And you can see there it followed the path, went all the way around, and then ended up really, really tiny over here in the end. If I go to the Paths panel and deselect it, you can see what's going on there. So this is a great way you can also draw paths to follow somebody's silhouette. You could follow a piece of typography, but it gives you the ability to pattern along a path using a photograph. Now, traditionally in Photoshop, if you wanted to create some randomness like this, you had to do it with a brush using the jitter controls. And you actually can't use a photograph as a brush and retain its color, shades, hues, and details. It's basically a stamp, and then whatever color you pick as the foreground color is applied to the shades of that brush. So using these new pattern fills gives us a lot of opportunity to work over and over again with a photo in a geometric way. So I like this, and I might even go back in and say, you know what? I'm going to fill it with that pattern one more time, place it along that path, but this time I'm going to go in and change some of those settings here. So we'll get a little bit tighter. We've got our angle set again. We'll just nudge it so it's slightly different than last time. Scale progression here. How much do we want to space it out? Maybe a little bit more dense this time. Press OK again. And now I've added more leaves. So you can see I can build that out to create the effect and create this illusion. So a very, very cool way of working with our patterns here and doing something interesting with the geometry. So, all right, let's look at something else. All right, so let's add some type to our design. One of the things that I've been seeing in a lot of these sort of fashion and sports athletics designs are people playing with type in interesting abstract ways. So let's just go in here and add a word real quick. I'm going to add the French word for leaf. And I'm going to free transform that so it's nice and big so we can see it. Now, we're just really going to use this for design elements, just to abstract in the background here. But I want to warp it. I want to do something really, really interesting with it rather than just have traditional type. And the problem is if you go to warp type, all you get are these default options for your warping. You can't use custom, and we want to use custom. So I'm just going to press OK so that the resize is applied. And then what I'm going to do is go to that text layer and choose Convert to Smart Object. And this means now that the file will see it as if it's just pixels, even though the type is embedded in the Smart Object. And there's an important reason for that when you talk about boosting your workflow. If I go to Free Transform now and choose to warp, you can see Custom is the default, which means I can go in here and click and do some really interesting kind of abstract things, just pulling it around in strange, fun, David Carson-like ways. One of my favorite designers when I was studying in design college. So we'll go in here and we'll add some of this warping and adjustment. Now, we get this to a place that we like it. Okay, and I'm just going to curve this out a bit more. Happy with that, I'll press enter. Now, if the client came back later and said, what about changing the font? Well, I could double click on this, go into the Smart Object, double click on the text layer that's embedded in there, and that's why we didn't rasterize it. And then you could go choose some other kind of font. Now, just for graphic differentiation, I'll choose Amador here so you can see this Gothic black letter style font when I make the change. Let me press save. That saves the smart object. We go back to our file now. And now you can see that that has been modified. So now we've got this really interesting kind of type character going on. So let me scale that up a little bit bigger so we can see more of it. I might rotate it as well. All right. So we got that going on in here. Press enter. Now, the last thing is, what would you do if the client came back again and said, could you change the color of the font? Well, of course, we could double click and go back into the smart object. But if I was trying to work very quickly, I could just use layer styles down here and choose color overlay. So if I choose color overlay, now I can pick a different color. Maybe there's like a mint green or lime or something like that. The blue is kind of fun, but I think I want something a little bit more popping. So let's use this kind of limoncello here. Press OK. And now that layer style is being applied here. So if for some reason they change their mind again later, it's as simple as turning the eyeball off rather than having to double click and go back into the smart object again and again and again. Now, the last thing that I want to do here is mask this out into an elliptical marquee. And I want to show that because the topic here is nesting masks. So let's take a look at nesting masks. Okay, so for nesting masks, this is just a real simple closer, but it's worth noting for workflow. So you can see we've got our model here that has a mask on the image. We could do layer styles in here like we do have on the text. But what if we wanted to bring all this together and still take advantage of layer styles? Well, you can select all of these layers and put them in a layer group. Just hold Shift and click on the layer group icon down at the bottom here. It looks like a little folder. And when you hold Shift, it automatically adds them. If you didn't hold Shift, then it would create the group and you'd have to drag everything in manually. So the last thing I want to show here is if I was to actually make a rectangular marquee selection and sort of hold Shift to get this to be a perfect circle. We'll just move this over here. This means that when I press the mask button, instead of it being on a layer, we can add it to the layer group, even though we have masks inside of the group on their own individual layers. And so this gives us the advantage that we could, for example, go back to this leaf layer now and move that around so we get to see some more of those leaves. We could add another layer at the bottom here. Let's just add that, send that to the back. I'm going to fill that with a lighter tone. And now we can move everything in the group up. And on top of the nested mask, we can add more layer styles to the treatment, like a nice white stroke on here and maybe a drop shadow. And this gives us the ability to click and drag around, move our shadow, add that to our design element. And if we want to, we could add more selections, more marquees, and if we fill these with white on that particular layer group, it's going to automatically pick up that style, which is really, really handy when you're trying to do mass edits like this. So, so I don't have to think about applying this multiple times. I just go onto the layer mask here, fill that with white, and you can see those elements get added. Alrighty, let's close this out. All right, well, with that, we are done. We covered a lot in this lab session. And the first thing I will say, if you felt overwhelmed, is remember it's a video. You're going to have the ability to go back and watch this again, pause it, write down your notes, make sure you feel comfortable with the techniques, explore freely, and hopefully it was beneficial for you. So my name is Mark Heaps. Thank you so much for coming to my session. I really appreciate you giving me the time. For those of you that have been in my sessions before, thank you for returning. I really appreciate your support. Make sure that you let Adobe know in the surveys if you enjoyed this session or if you learned anything. Maybe they'll invite me back to do this again next year. And if you want to keep the conversation going, follow me on social media at LifeByPixels, and I love to hear the questions and challenges that designers out there in the trenches are really dealing with, so maybe I can figure out what's the next tip and technique I can show everybody. All right, everybody, have a great Adobe Max, and hopefully I'll see you sometime soon in the future.